Welcome to the 4Q podcast. My name is Sheena Shui. I have a Bachelor of Psychology, Masters of Counselling, and Masters of Social Work. My aim is to normalise rather than pathologise life. And in this podcast, we talk all things therapy, women's mental health, leadership, and business. So if you're ready to learn some tips, tricks, and hear some amazing stories to really amplify your life and your business, let's get into it. Welcome again to the 4Q podcast. Welcome back to another episode. Thank you for being here and thank you for taking the time to invest in yourself, invest in your personal growth. That's fantastic that you're doing that for yourself. It might seem like a given, but I can tell you so many of the people that I work with inside my practice, inside my two businesses, don't actually do this. It's amazing once you surround yourself with people who do personal development and you're on a personal development journey, it can be really easy to forget that a lot of people don't reflect. A lot of people don't turn inwards. A lot of people don't actually take the time to learn about the world and about themselves and think from a philosophical perspective, a psychological, a social perspective. So thank you for doing that. I think the world will be a better place with the people who do that and take the time doing life by design, life with intention, rather than life by default. So, new intro for those of you who are new here. This is a new intro that I have to the podcast, so I'd love to know your thoughts. And for my OGs who have been here for a while, it's a new post, it's a new intro. We're slightly shifting, as you can tell, and we're really going to be focusing a bit more on leadership and that kind of thing. We've been doing it in the business for a while, but our content hasn't reflected that. So let us know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. So, does it feel like every second person you hear today is talking about ADHD or getting themselves diagnosed with ADHD or AuDHD, which is autism and ADHD, or autism? It seems like it's a bit of a trend or that kind of thing, and every second person's talking about neurodivergence. So I want to break it down around why this is occurring and why it feels that way and what does it actually mean. So let's talk about what a diagnosis is for a second. A diagnosis is just a name for a group of symptoms. But a reason that a diagnosis can sometimes be helpful is that it helps us in terms of treatment options and research. So if we group a bunch of symptoms together, and let's say we would call it social anxiety, then we can do tests on people who, what we call, meet the criteria of having the symptoms of social anxiety, and we can do different treatment options to see which ones are the most effective. So then that way, when someone presents with these same symptoms, we can use the most effective treatment methods for those symptoms. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated because for those who don't know, who are not in the psychology, counselling, psychiatric, medical world, there is a book called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, where we all use this as health practitioners to see if somebody meets criteria. So it's got all the mental health diagnoses. It talks about epidemiology. So how do these diagnoses often develop? What does it look like? What are the examples of how the symptoms play out for people? How often is it in men and in women and all that sort of thing? What age you can diagnose, because there's a lot of diagnoses that can't happen until after 18, that kind of a thing. But that is the place to go for when we want to see a diagnosis and look at the criteria and go, does this person present with these symptoms? Oh, they must have this diagnosis. Now, this is going to trip you out. there's been some research in the last few years around the effectiveness of this manual. So what they found is that 80% of the symptoms overlap in the DSM. That's a lot. So as you can imagine, it's extremely difficult for us to differentiate between different anxieties, different disorders. So many of these disorders overlap. They might be slightly variant. So some of the research is saying it's actually scientifically meaningless. Like it's a big old book of gobbledygook. And so I'm in the middle where I think it's extremely useful sometimes because it does show you some trends. But nowadays, unless you want to take medication, which is another benefit of diagnosis, or you're looking, perhaps in children mostly to get more sorts of supports for maybe education, schooling, home life, that kind of thing through, government funding. As an adult, there's not a huge amount of benefit for getting a diagnosis, like I said, unless you want more supports or you want to take medication. Because as therapists, we can treat the symptoms. Because here's the other thing is that let's say a treatment works for 90% of people with ADHD. Everybody varies. And so what might work for 90% doesn't work for everyone. And so we really need to be flexible as practitioners to make sure that the treatments or the things that we do in session, the way that we work with you is catered to you. Now, there are models that explain these group of symptoms a lot better in terms of hypoarousal and hyperarousal. So when you've got too much adrenaline and cortisol in your body, or when you lack it and it starts to shut down. So more one side is more anxiety based, the other side's more depressive based, and a lot of ADHD symptoms fit in the hyper state, things that drive anxiety as well. So some of the symptoms that are common between both ADHD and anxiety, for example, are the restlessness, the memory loss, the difficulty with time, the overwhelm, the lack of wanting to engage socially sometimes. All of that is really common. That can happen in bipolar. That can happen in a lot of different diagnoses. So what's more important is looking at the symptoms. But if we want to talk about why do we think that so many people are now presenting with the symptoms of ADHD, autism, that kind of thing, I want to start with ADHD first because, it's marked, a lot of people sort of stereotype it as that distractibility and that kind of thing, but it can also be just the brain works differently. And when I mean differently, that's hard to say too. Differently to who? There is a bit of controversy out there that ADHD and autism brains are different to brains that work in a capitalist society. So people who are ADHD or autistic often are really great business owners, leaders, and that kind of thing because they don't like doing things normally. It's excruciating to the point of painful, living a mundane doing a 9 to 5 job, doing what most people would consider a great life, house in the burbs, that kind of thing, can feel excruciating and meaningless because we want more, we strive for more, we're aiming for more. So it's sort of saying, okay, your brain works differently and it doesn't function quite well in a world that's based around people who have a different brain to you. So is it that you're abnormal or is it that you're just different? It doesn't need to mean that there's an issue here. But what happens is that if you're trying to conform to your lifestyle to the world that we're in and not adjust your lifestyle to your brain, so the way that you work day to day, the way you do your chores, it's going to feel like you're constantly in a struggle. So you need to be able to, for ADHD and autistic brains, you need to be able to adjust, say, doing the laundry, doing the dishes, everyday schedules to the way that your brain works, rather than trying to fit it into the way that other people who maybe don't have these symptoms, how their brain works. So why do so many people present, why does it seem like there's such a rise in it? There's a lot of environmental factors that are contributing to these symptoms. So in Johann Hari's book, not the Social Dilemma, that is the documentary that talks about this stuff, but the stolen focus, he talks about how, and in the Social Dilemma they talk about this too, it's the same people, of how social media platforms and even our phones are designed to hold our attention, steal our attention. We have so much dopamine, so the pleasure chemical going, and all of that dopamine going around in our brains is calling to us. Not only is it addictive, so it makes us susceptible to all sorts of other addictions because we're just looking for that increased activity in our brain. But every time we're trying to focus, there's that feeling, there's that calling of pulling towards something that's going to be exciting and incredible and pleasurable, because we're used to so much stimulation through our phones and social media. So it's absolutely playing havoc on the way that we focus, on the way that we do things. And also the pace of the world that we live in is extremely fast compared to our ancestors. Even though we have the same brains, the same body, evolution hasn't caught up. It takes thousands of years for our brains to evolve to its environment, to make changes. So the last few generations where we've really decreased the amount of family time we have, support that we have, the things that our brains was wired to do, which is make relationships, be in nature, be out there and supporting one another and loving one another, which, sounds really hippy-dippy, but that's what our brains are wired to do, the structures are. And so if we're wired for connectivity, for love, for time together, and what we're living in is actually quite the opposite, then of course it's going to be distractible, it's going to feel off, we're going to feel anxious, depressed, we're going to have these symptoms of distractibility and going up and down and feeling like, oh, I want to do this, but I want to do this, that constant push-pull feeling that comes with ADHD, anxiety, all of that. And again, autism is standing out a bit more because as we push and as we change and as we put more and more and more on our schedules, of course it's going to stand out if your brain works not to a society built around one type of brain. There's all types of different brains out there, but our society is so structured and rigid in terms of our schooling system, our work systems, the way that our, support systems work with forms and people and all of that, that if your brain works differently, it's not supported. And you have to think back to olden times where if people did have a variety of brains, your skill set could be used to its advantage because, we had creativity, we had time, we needed that variety, we needed new and creative ways of doing things. But we were so supported with one another that if we tried something new and made a mistake, it didn't matter because we were all together. And so we supported each other, as opposed to if it's just you out there in the world taking care of you and you make a mistake, that can have huge implications. If it's just you being the breadwinner for your family, if your family can't put food on the table, if you're not two incomes, all that sort of stuff, being creative and making mistakes and not having a brain that fits to the mold can feel like detrimental. even though it's not. So what we need to do, and what I would challenge you to ask yourself, whether you relate to ADHD and autism, whether you have friends, relatives that do, or whether you own a business and you want to create a business that is incredible, is how can you harness the power of these brains? Because let me tell you, ADHD brains get shit done like nobody else's business. And maybe I can vouch for that because I know that I meet criteria for that one. But the same with autistic brains is that they're incredible with pattern recognition. And that's why they're great at reading people, even though there's this misconception that they're not great socially. If somebody acts differently, they can tell, because they're great with pattern recognition. And so they're really good at telling when someone's off. Because of that, oh, you're not acting in your normal pattern, more so than others. It's just natural to them. But also, so great with pattern recognition, but putting pieces together of things that normally would be really difficult to put together. I find autistic brains are incredible with this, and that's why the IQ is high, because they can use concepts from so many different fields of, per se, anthropology and mathematics and things like that, putting things that seemingly don't go together so well that they can create solutions and ideas that are incredible. So having an environment, having a workplace where you can really use that to your advantage is really helpful. And so the ways that you can do this is actually scheduling in creative time, or scheduling times where people can, think about solutions or be innovative and go, what do you guys want to work on? Work on whatever you feel like working on. Or set your own schedule. Just sort of tell your team, look, these are the deadlines. This is what I want done. You set your schedule and how you do it. Because if you try to tell someone, this happens at this time, this happens at this time, so we do this at 10 o'clock, this at 9 o'clock, this at 11 o'clock, but that's not their natural rhythm, their natural mental, energetic rhythm, you're not going to get the most out of them. So don't get me wrong. I know that we've got to have meetings and things like that, but some of your people are going to work fantastic in the morning and terrible in the afternoon. Some of your people are going to work fantastic in the afternoons or even at night, but they're not great before 12, midday. So it's asking the people that you work with and asking yourself, what's my best rhythm? How do you get the best out of me? And how can I get the best out of you? And then actually creating an environment that allows that. So, but that takes a level of self-awareness. And sometimes we don't have that. And sometimes staff don't have that. So get them thinking about, what do they need to be doing, to reflecting on and asking them to think about, if I get the best out of you, what's that going to look like? What do you want your schedule to look like? What do you want freedom in? If I let you go, do you want to be able to do this, or do you need rigidity and structure from me? Some people respond well to a deadline, others don't. Some people can't deal with just going, work on whatever you want to, whereas other people thrive and create incredible things under that. Some people need more direction, less direction. So it's encouraging your team to be self-aware and then to be able to articulate that to you, and do that for yourself as well. And making sure that everybody's still making sure they have their lunch breaks and that, because we need breaks for our brain to have the best creativity. Hence why the Pomodoro method is so effective and things like that. So I hope that this was really interesting for you. And another way of thinking, why does everyone seem to have autism or ADHD, or the neurodiversity is growing? And don't get me wrong, there is a genetic component, which we didn't touch on today that much, but if I can briefly touch on the genetic component, is that yes, there is some genetics to it, but our genetic studies show us that environment can determine whether a genetic gets turned on or off. But there are stronger genetics for autism than there is ADHD. But again, regardless, environment is huge in the way that is created. So just bear that in mind, that there's a component to, a genetic component to who we are, our brains, our personality, but environment is the larger factor in these diagnoses and other diagnoses. There's other ones that are more genetic, but we're not getting into that today, in case you were wondering about that. But again, I hope that this offered you a new perspective, a new way of thinking about things, an explanation as to why you're seeing this everywhere at the moment. And I hope that you're more kind to yourself if you're maybe you've been told lately that have one of these things and you don't know what to make of it or process it. I think having these open conversations about this is really important, because particularly I find when I have to tell people in session, look, I think you might fit the criteria for this, but let me explain that that's not a bad thing. Because it can be confronting to think that sometimes of, I've got this diagnosis and what does this mean for me? So just know that it's incredible and it can really be a gift if it's harnessed in the right way. But I can understand how it's scary when you don't fit the mold of what society tells you to be in. That's tricky. So make your own mold and create a culture that supports all types of people, all types of personalities, all types of brains. All right, again, thank you for being here. I'm so proud of you for taking this time for you and investing in enlightening yourself and growing yourself. And I will see you next episode of the 4Q podcast. Bye for now.